A small park lies off a little bay, hugging the east coastal fringe of Sydney. Here, young men and children train to play the game of rugby league.
Cannot beat football like that.
They train for this weekly game, where you put all that has been rehearsed into action. There have been weekends like this for 100 years in Clovelly.
K-grade grand final between Clovelly and St Charles, number 8.
Hamilton is soiled. That is...
Rugby league has been an essential part of these communities for generations.
Everything together. We run on together, we attack together, we hit the ball up together, we make our tackles together.
Every club has its story, but ours has been a century in the making. Before there was any Clovelly, there were the traditional landowners, the Gadigal and the Bidjigal, two of the 29 tribal groups forming the Eora Nation. The Eora people was the name given to the coastal Aboriginal peoples around Sydney, but little is known of them, although some relics can still be seen in the area. In the early part of last century, Clovelly was known as Little Coogee. It was renamed in 1913 after a tiny fishing village in Devon. It was not so dissimilar to its British cousin. Both were remote and, in the Aussie Clovelly's case, almost unreachable. In the 19th century, it was just a tiny hamlet in a lost corner of Sydney's eastern coastline. By the early 20th century, Clovelly slowly grew. A surf lifesaving brigade was formed in 1907, becoming one of Sydney's best, and more people moved into this forgotten piece of paradise. Around 1909, major subdivisions for domestic housing commenced. Within 3 years, a tram line was operating, linking Clovelly to the rest of Sydney. This tiny hamlet, hidden in the 19th century, was becoming a bustling little village in the 20th. Public works commenced. Industries such as tram manufacturing were nearby, and a suburb with its own distinctive coastal atmosphere was forming. To outsiders, Clovelly was often dismissed, nicknamed Poverty Point. The people were poor, but they grew close and loved their patch of beach. The small slither of coast had a strong beating heart. And then came the war to end all wars. 100 years ago, Australia came out of the war having lost more young men per capita than any other nation. Returning soldiers were disheartened by what they had experienced. Lives had to be rebuilt. Rugby league was a tonic for young men disheartened by the war experience, but they were encouraged by the mateship that bonded them during the war. No other game allowed them to play it fair, but play it hard. The men of the Clovelly Lifesaving Brigade wanted something they could call their own. They wanted a game that set them apart from the ruling class. The game of rugby league offered them this freedom. Rugby league was the obvious way forward for the winter months, and the game was already building momentum on the backs of the bigger clubs. This was a game that treated the men fairly, paid them properly and gave them a communal life. They weren't doing it for king and country, but for family and friends. This was, and still is, the way of suburban rugby league. From 1918, Clovelly was forging its own character. The village of 1909 was now becoming a strong community, inspired by surf and sport. The eastern suburbs was dotted with rugby league clubs, and the rivalry was fierce. Little is known about the early days of rugby league at Clovelly. A fire in the 1980s destroyed nearly all the club records. In 1935, Les Bryant ran the Clovelly Football Club. The colours were light blue and dark blue, representing the sea and the sky. We have Gazette articles and newspaper clippings of the time. We know that in the early 1930s, the club played as the Clovelly Seagulls. The team went on to win the B-grade competition in 1936 and was again successful in 1939. Many of these players went on to play first grade for either Souths or Easts. Play ceased during World War II. In 1945, a B-grade team entered into East's Junior District League, sponsored by the Clovelly Surf Club. Butch Bottomley was the principal organiser of the 1945 team. He was assisted by Harry McEwen, who would preside over the club for the next 30 years. They trained on a grass plot where the kiosk now stands. The playing jersey at this time was blue with a red, white and navy blue V. After the horror of the Second World War, life returned to near normality. At the time, the rugby league clubs were for adults and young men. Children played the game only in school, in weight divisions. Junior rugby league was yet to emerge. The 1940s and early 1950s was the era of legendary players like Butch Bottomley, Lenny Bennett and Arthur Manson. Warren Pegg remembers it as one of the best times to be a junior rugby league player.
The A grade in the Eastern Suburbs Junior League was the greatest junior league in Sydney. The amount of clubs that were involved. And famous clubs like the Celebrity Club, the Wharfies, the Dragons, Bondi United, Paddington Colt, Avalon. That's something I can just think of now. In fact, Jack Gibson started his career at the Celebrity Club, owned by Joe Taylor. Joe also owned Tomo's 2-Up School, and Jack worked on the door at the Celebrity Club. But they had great battles with the Waterside Workers, and the Wharfies at Celebrity Club battled it out. But Clovelly always had an A-grade side. They were always competitive, but Clovelly always strived to get their 4 teams.
There were 4 grades, and only the A-grade teams were paid anything like a decent wage for their efforts.
£5 a win, £3 a draw and £2 a loss. We had a good side, yeah, very good side. We got into the semis. We were minor premiers. There was a lot of gambling that went on. The junior league was a rife place for big bets. If we won a game, you might get a handshake and be congratulated, and there might be something left in your hand after the handshake.
By the late 1950s, there was a push for lower age grades, E and younger. South Juniors emerged and were expanding. This soon began to catch on at Easts and elsewhere. Clovelly wanted to be part of the push. With this change came a new look for the club. Players loved to don the distinctive St George-like red and white jersey. St George was the greatest club of the time, but by today's standards, conditions were pretty primitive. Life as a whole had few complexities for young men who loved rugby league.
For the injured, there was only one stretcher at Waverley Oval. The occasion that I can remember was that I went to kick a ball and an opponent tried to kick the ball and I got there first, and when I followed through, he kicked me right up the shin and just opened my shin right open, and I just looked down on it because I was a student at the time, and I just held the wound together. And the guy who was playing outside me at that stage, as outside centre, he came across and was a little bit squeamy about blood, and he had one look at it and passed out, and he got carried off in the stretcher and I had to walk off.
Behind the growth and new look for the club was President Harry McEwen and coaches Keith Goodsell, Dave Hunter and a little later Arthur Manson. These men were a new generation of coaches that had vision and passion for the game. They realised this was more than a game. It was a vehicle not only for fitness, but as a social glue for a community and as a means to build standards of discipline for young men growing up in the area. The Manson family has offered 3 generations of players to the club. We know that there were members of the Manson family playing in the 1920s. Arthur Manson, who later returned as a successful coach and club president, played in the late 1940s and 1950s, and his son Ian was a junior grade player in the 1970s and 1980s. Mark Preston, who played in the 1970s and 1980s, remembers his coach Arthur Manson as a solid coach who taught the fundamentals.
He was only a short, stocky guy, but he had a voice that you could hear from one end of Burrows Park to the other, and if you crossed him, you knew it. Tough but fair, and got results.
Keith Goodsall was the surf club captain. He took the surf and turf idea to the max, handpicking teams and finding talent in schools wherever he could. He made sure that if you were in the surf club, you were in the leagues club. Everybody stayed together.
Dad was the sort of person that he just wanted to help the kids all the time. He didn't have a very good life as a boy, and he wanted to make sure that everyone else coming through under his guidance had a better life than what he had. In training, when I was only 8 or 9, up at Burrows Park, he'd sit on my neck and make me lift him up to build up my muscles around my shoulders and neck, and thank God he did, because I could lift a scrum by myself.
Keith Goodsall was just an incredible human being. Just a great bloke. Actually, he had a big impact on a lot of our lives. But I'll get back to that in a sec.
I'm sorry.
Goodsall was a teetotaler and a fitness fanatic who would go on to nurture a new generation of great footballers whom he would oversee for the next decade. Many of Goodsall's protégés would go on to play junior representative football and ultimately make the grade for the Eastern Suburbs Club. Clovelly was a club on the move, building great players for the highest levels of the game.
Kevin Bottomley said to me once, he said, where do you want to go, when he tried to instill confidence in the players. He said, where do you want to play? I said, I want to play for East. And that was my goal, to play for East somewhere along the way. And I think that was most of young players' dreams.
As the game developed and rugby league became the state's biggest winter sport, Clovelly moved into the big time. The 1961 side, one of the club's most successful ever, was due to tour Perth. But there was a shortfall. The club needed £2,500 to get there. The easiest way to make up the funds was to have an illegal betting night.
Dad hired the Chinese restaurant opposite the Clovelly pub for the night, invited Perth and all the illegal gambling casino people. The most money they got was from the Chinese person who owned the restaurant. He gambled so much that he actually lost the restaurant to my dad and the Clovelly Football Club. And at the end of the night, Dad gave it back to me.
Coach Dave Hunter emerged at around this time, and he was to nurture the next generation of young men into the 1960s and 1970s, including Brian Garland, Andy Kelly, Ronnie Simpson, Jeff Broadstock, and many other club legends. There were great competitive teams in this period, from the early 1960s right into the early 1970s, and the club won numerous grand finals in various grades. It was a golden era for the Clovelly Club. It was the inspiring Keith Goodsall who used to have his players run repeated laps of the oval.
Keith changed the face of football, in Clovelly. He had a great squad.
Keith was a bit different. He was probably a man or a coach before his time, but he drilled into us fitness, and that was one of the big reasons why we won so many competitions. If my memory serves me right, on 59 we won the Eastern Suburbs competition. 60 we got beat in the grand final in South Sydney. 61 we won the competition in Western Suburbs. 62 and 63 we won the Eastern Suburbs Junior League competition, and then I think 63 Kenny McMorrow, who was a former Eastern Suburbs first grade halfback, he coached us, and we won I think 2 competitions and lost one with Kenny.
It didn't matter how hard he pushed the kids. All the players loved Keith and the late Kenny McMorrow, whom they called second fathers. Scott Bennett remembers the aura around Ken McMorrow in the 70s.
There is a name that is Clovelly through and through. It's Ken McMorrow. My first memory of Ken is being in Clovelly Surf Club and my dad and Ken talking with each other. And then Dad coming up, I must have been very young, and Dad coming up and says, "You know that man there? That man played for the Roosters." And I looked at him and I just thought, he's only my size, and I would have been about 8 years old. My confidence was always stronger after talking with Ken. He was a very positive man and always nipping around. I could imagine him playing as a nippy little halfback and, you know, snapping at the heels of those forwards. He was a lovely man, Ken McMorrow.
Kenny McMorrow, I believe, was the toughest halfback I've ever seen. He'd be lucky to weigh 9.5 stone, and you pick him up like a rag doll and throw him against the wall. But the beltings he took at the eastern suburbs was amazing. Never complained, and a fine halfback as well.
Who kept it all afloat in those years? For nearly 3 decades, the financial backing came from Harry McEwen, an independently wealthy man whose house overlooked Clovelly Beach. He was always there for Clovelly until his death in the mid-1970s. He was an enigmatic figure, except when it came to Clovelly, which was his greatest passion. He was a well-known bookie in Randwick and was most beloved for his total devotion to the club, their players and families.
Harry McEwen was Mr. Clovelly. He was like a grandfather to me. He wore a suit and collar and tie, which they did in the old days, to every game. When we won the first competition and he got his blazer, he never took it off. I don't think ever after that. He wore it every day. He was something special to me. Clovelly would never be around without Harry McEwen.
Harry McEwen, who was the president of the club, was a very kind person, a very quiet person, did a lot for the club, financed a lot of the businesses. Harry had a good business on the side and was able to finance a few things. Gambling was quite a thing in Sydney of those days. He was a very quiet man. He helped a lot of people. He helped my grandmother and grandfather with just taxi money to get me back and forth from football games.
Never thought about who financed the club, who paid for the jumpers or the shorts or the socks. I know we only got one of each, and it had to last you the season. And if you lost it, you had to, it's like an inquest to get a second pair. And if you damaged it, they usually patched it up. So you got your jumper and that was it. And if you're a real good boy, they gave it to you at the end of the season.
We were unbeatable. Harry McEwen once put up probably about $1,000 at the time for anyone to take us on and try and beat us. We played Liverpool and we played a few others, but no one could beat us.
In the 1960s and 70s, there was a new lure for kids to become rugby league stars. Clovelly was already a strong feeder to the Eastern Suburbs Club, and some of its players were in contention for representative honours. There were some greats of the period. Names which still resonate, like Des O'Reilly, who played for Easts and New South Wales, Paul Cross, Graham Mayhew, Union International Phil Smith, International Surf Club champion Bob Green, Colin Campbell, and Ken McMorrow. Even back then, the Clovelly bond was strong. Once you played for Clovelly, you were always one of them, even if you ended up playing for an opposing side. McMorrow remembers playing against Ron Sadlow in 1960. Sadlow, a former Easts and Clovelly's junior, was playing on the opposing team.
I made a break and I heard, "Yeah, Kenny, watch out." And I ducked my head and a coat hanger went over my head. cane went over my head. I looked around, I was Ronnie. I went, Ronnie, Clovelly.
There was plenty of high jinks on and off the field in the formative years of rugby league. Graham Walker remembers the speed of Paul Cross. Nobody in the opposition could catch him. So, on one occasion, they resorted to other tactics.
We got the ball to Cross in, he's flying down the wing, and Bobby Crotty's standing on the sideline. And as Paul Cross is flying down the wing, ready to cross inside and put the ball down underneath the post, Bobby Crotty's hooked him with the umbrella right around the ankle and dropped Crossy flat in his face. And the brawls erupted, and the referees walked off the field and abandoned the game. And the next time we played them behind a picket fence up at Waverley Oval, so there was no spectators around. But it was an absolute riot.
There were players that made a huge mark around this time. Des O'Reilly, the great Eastern Suburbs second rower, arrived at Clovelly in 1969 as a fresh 15-year-old. Clovelly was the natural choice. Once he came to Clovelly, he never went back to Bondi.
He trained harder than everyone else. He got the training early. He did extra stuff after. He wasn't a fancy player, but he was non-stop, perpetual motion for that whole period. Des was always the first guy you wanted. Me as a lazy front rower, Des was always the guy you wanted picked to do your tackling.
He made you look good.
He made us look good. That's right. I was happy to run with the ball and have Des do all my tackling.
Since its formation in 1918, there was one thing Clovelly didn't have: a winning A-grade grand final team. That changed in 1970 and 1971, when the side won the grand final in both years, and they were all coached by one of Clovelly's toughest ever, Dave Hunter. Ronnie Simpson played 177 games for the club, 5 of which were grand final wins. The most memorable being the young 1970 A-grade winning team.
We were on 15-13, that's how close it was we won that competition. Paddo Colts that day had about 6 or 7 grade players in there. They were 20-1 on to win the competition. They won everything. They won the semi-final to get in the grand final, something like about 20-30 points. We scraped in, we had no hope. 19 in the squad, there was something like 12 or 13 B graders. That's why I was so emotional.
The best part was that everyone jumped the fence, and I've never seen it before. Like, supporters just jumped the fence when the full-time siren went, and it was all the bell, and it was just incredible. It was just emotional. We all went back in the dressing room, and I think the yelling went for about 45 minutes non-stop, just cheering and cheering and cheering.
It was even more so for club president Harry McEwen.
He always wanted to win a A-grade grand final, and the year we did win it, he actually received the trophy from the president of the Junior Rugby League for Eastern Suburbs on our behalf. Oh, you could almost see the tears in his eyes at the time. He was elated.
At the same time, people were saying there was some kind of magic about Chloe. Every local kid wanted to play for the club and grab that jersey. The media was in on the act too. You could watch Controversy Corner with Rex Mossop or listen to Frank Hyde on the radio. Rugby league was big time in the eastern states. The same buzz was there at Clovelly. Many Clovelly players had become household names, and every kid in the area wanted to be like them. At the highest level, the competition between some teams was ferocious. The C-grade team won the 1982 final against their biggest rivals, the Eastern Suburbs Catholic Club, who had beaten Clovelly by a point in the semi. The boys had a point to prove in the final.
When we won the grand final, we painted the road outside the Clovelly Hotel. We won 26-0 in big bold letters, and it lasted on the road for about 6 months. It was a good party time.
Since the 1940s, the Clovelly Club was referred to as the Bay, or just Bays. In 1983, the club wanted and needed to refresh its image with a new name. People often ask about the origins of the name Crocodiles.
Just said you're performing like a team of fucking crocodiles, and I said that's not going to get it done. And I said, do you understand what I'm talking about here? I said, crocodiles. I said, they just lay there, they don't look at anybody else, they just do their own thing. I said, that's what you blokes are doing. And now it's everywhere. But it was an innocent throwaway line that became something pretty serious. And there you have it. The Clovelly Crocodiles. There was nothing premeditated about it. It just blurbled out, and yeah, it's been good. It's stuck.
The Clovelly Crocodile. And here are their sponsors. They're sponsored by the Grand Clovelly, the Charing Cross Hotels, Jim Mac, SO, Clovelly Auto Port, and Warlords.
Makes around that little bloke from WR for a winger. Right, Lewis gets it to McShane. McShane on to Anderson. Anderson shuffles, comes back down the middle.
By the mid to late 1980s, the times were changing. Soccer, rugby union and basketball were now competing with rugby league. It was not always the first choice sport for local kids, as it had been for previous generations. To cap it all, the club was going through a tough phase. There was negativity about the violence of rugby league. By the early 1990s, the club was at crisis point. Linda McIntosh, who describes herself as being dragged into coaching, remembers how difficult it was to get enough junior players to make up the teams, let alone find enough people to run the club.
This is where the exhausting bit comes in, because it was sort of who will do this job, who will do that job, and at one stage there it got down to my husband and I and one other person, and my husband said, well, I'll be the treasurer, and Daypick said, well, I'll be the president, so that all the positions were filled by virtually 3 to 4 people. You know, we're at the point of folding if we can't, you know, my husband and I can't keep doing this. We can't keep working our own jobs with our own family and our own commitments and trying to run this football club full time.
Just as they had before, the local families entered the fray, providing much needed support. When the Crocs needed junior personnel, the locals responded. Sid Eckstein, who was part of the committee in 1994, realised that Clovelly had to rebuild the team from the bottom up.
I think at the ages of 6, 7 and 9, that's what we were looking at the time, to number one, increase the numbers in those age groups. Therefore, you had to make it a family-friendly club. And that's why the growth of the club really came about from the under 6s up. Well, some people look at having an A grade, we look at it the other way. We don't care about the A grade. If the A grade comes, that's a bonus. But if you don't build from 6s up, the club will just have 1 or 2 teams or 3 teams. It'll never grow. You might lose them at a later age. At least you've got 8, 10, 12 teams in your club, and you've actually got a club, and the kids feel a part of that.
New blood came in. Drew Brabham, an army officer, joined the club. He, together with Philip Michael, brought in new ideas and initiatives and restructured the club. Brad Peterson, a former player, was asked to coach the under 6s and couldn't believe the state of the club when he arrived.
When I got down to the field, I found they only had 2 teams, a 6s and a 7s, 17 players in total. Clovelly was a mite smaller club than when I used to play. Anyway, through that we had a good president and vice president who did a business development course, applied it to the club, and within about a 10-year period we had 23 or 24 teams.
During this rebuilding phase in the late 1990s, the man who lived, breathed and loved Clovelly returned. After more than 2 decades, Keith Goodsall offered his services, and Clovelly was only too happy to accept him. Clovelly's prodigal son had returned.
Keith, when I started coaching back at Clovelly, I noticed used to walk past on his afternoon walks and stop at the fence and just watch the boys. I called him over, hey Keith, can you come over here and give me a hand, I need your help. Anyway, Keith came over and then was there every Thursday. Kept giving a hand for that season, and then convinced him to coach a side the following year. At this stage of his life, he was probably in his late 70s, early 80s. He coached for several years after that, and all the kids called him Pop.
Clovelly had re-established itself as one of the principal junior rugby league clubs in the eastern suburbs. In 2004, the club was lucky enough to bring in Sean Kenny Dowell, a current Kiwi international, who showed his potential as soon as he ran on the field.
From the word go, There was just something about Sean that was just unbelievable. And during the season, he played a reserve grade. He scored 3 tries in the blink of an eye. It was just amazing. And that was like a 16, 17-year-old playing A reserve grade. In all my years at Clovelly and dealing with kids, I've never seen a footballer who was so level-headed and so humble. And we're so glad that he came to Clovelly and made a great career at the Roosters from such humble beginnings.
And myself personally, I've met a lot of great people at the club, and Sid Eckstein and Anna Murata and Andrew Monaghan. They're great stalwarts of the Clovelly Crocodiles, and they've really helped me still really cherish those friendships and relationships that I have with those people now. Accepting us as young 15-year-olds, and it really created a platform for me to reach my highest goals and my potential.
The club has never looked stronger, but there are challenges. Club coach Adrian Lamb says that there will always be competition for kids in the area, and Clovelly has to remain aggressive in promoting its values.
Clovelly isn't the biggest region, and so we have our challenges there as well, but then we've got, because it's the Silvertail area, as they say, we've got all the private schools around too that promote rugby union. So not only have we got the challenge of not having a lot of children in the area, but we also have another sport that's very aggressive at securing the services of these young players and men. What's our sport about? What's rugby league about? Rugby league's about getting participants in at a younger age to give them an opportunity to have the experience of playing in teams, weekly competitions, and just to get them off the street, really.
Found this out of my rugby league experience, that you've got to be capable of playing for each other. Now that might sound so simple. You've got to train like that. You've got to live like that. I said it's got to be part and parcel of you. And you're going to be lucky enough to play with a group of guys, play for each other. That carries on to the modern day. Teams that play for each other are successful with each other. If you go out and you really play for each other, the other team have got to play that much higher. You've got to raise their standard.
Even though we want to evolve the game into a new level, it's always the basic little structures that are most successful. Running hard and tackling hard. Things don't change. You know how hard it is to coach someone to run hard? And for them to listen and actually physically do it, change, it's difficult, it's really difficult. When the young child watches rugby league, I think that it takes them to a different place, and they want to be that player or that person or be in that moment. And I guess, again, this is why rugby league is such a great sport, because it allows them to be like the person that they look up to. It allows them to be a part of a team, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned along the way there in life in general, whether it's, mateship or respect or teammates and working hard together as a group, never giving up, your ability to believe in yourself.
To describe my time at Clovelly Junior Rugby League Football Club would be to say it was exhausting, exhilarating, ups and downs, sometimes stressful, but ultimately rewarding. Rewarding just to see little kids that when you first threw the ball at them were too scared to catch it, running and scoring tries. And you just got such a big kick. Some boy that I didn't recognise that was now nearly eye level with me would come up and say, "Hi Linda, do you remember me? I'm Jamie, you coached me."
But I used to say to them that the memories of today you'll carry for the rest of your life. You'll never forget it if you lose, and you'll never forget it if you win. But more importantly, I said, look at the bloke beside you. I said, if you let him down, he'll never forget you. You're playing here, I said, for a lifetime of memories.
While watching these kids, it's a lot of little victories. Watching a lot of little victories. And that's what all that age football should be. Your first tackle, your first run, your first try, your first pass, your first catch. Your first time you beat the opposition. That's a big thrill for a lot of the kids. Instead of getting bashed up, jumped on, geez, I'm through the hole. What do I do now?
To think that a rugby league club can last 100 years in Sydney is magnificent, particularly in eastern suburbs, where the culture changed over so many years. To think that Clovelly is still there with the stalwarts like Bondi United and Paddington Colts, that they have lasted, is an absolute credit to the management and to the players and to the people that helped that club go.
For the community to be strong and support and have our volunteers turn up there week in, week out to make this great club continue over this amount of time is a true sign of greatness to a little club on the beach.
The Clovelly Crocs is a rare rugby league club with a century of little victories. It is a club that has endured while others have faded away. It continues the hopes and dreams and possibilities for this small beachside community, playing the greatest game of all, rugby league.